So, have you been waiting long for me? To talk about the Teeth of God graphic novel, anyway. This has been a very anticipated drop ever since its announcement, because if you've either watched my last Sleep Token video for any amount of time, or were in the community for more than a week, you will know how vague Sleep Token is with its story or lore or whatever we want to call it. So, the promise of some concrete story was extremely appealing to a large chunk of the fanbase, who have been licking mere molecules of story off the ground for years at this point. And just in case it isn't already abundantly clear by the runtime, I will be spoiling the entire book and then some with supplementary content. So, be warned and turn back now if you don't want anything revealed for you that you didn't want to see. Though, I did try to wait a long time to ensure everyone had gotten a copy, or at the very least wouldn't get too uppity about spoilers. Regardless, since everyone seemed to like my last video about Sleep Token so much, and oh my god, thank you for giving that video a shot, by the way. At the time of recording, it's got over 100,000 views, thank you so much. Because of that and also popular demand, I decided to make a follow-up video to that one. Though, that last video is not required reading for this one. But if you have watched it, now that we're all, you know, acquainted with the general idea of what Sleep Token's greater story kind of feels like, we're gonna take that and throw it out the window. This novel was nothing like I thought it was gonna be. Holy shit. So, real briefly for anyone new here, Teeth of God is a graphic novel that came out around December of 2024. It was written and conceptualized by anonymous band Sleep Token and created and illustrated in collaboration with Sumerian Comics. So, when it comes to Teeth of God, I was right about some things and wrong about others in my initial interpretation in my last video. So I wanted to run through those quickly. But before I do that, a couple quick disclaimers. Number one, I am not actually physically going to show the inside of the book that much, if at all. This is to avoid incurring the wrath of Sleep Token's new label or their new label's third-party copyright system, which takes great joy in copyright claiming even unmonetized fan art, so I'm not gonna take any chances there. Instead, I have hand illustrated any panels I felt needed to be included in the video, so anything you're gonna see in terms of depictions of the comic, with maybe a few exceptions, is gonna be my own artwork. Hope you enjoy that. Secondly, this entire video, much like the last one, is entirely my own thoughts and interpretations. Since the novel has no dialogue at all aside from letters from the director, whoa, spoilers already! Most of what I'm going to be talking about is just my own personal interpretation of this work, and as such, I could be wrong or you may not agree. Let's just keep this message in our hearts and minds, because, you know, Vessel clearly hates us and he never wants us to have any sort of concrete lore when it comes to his little OC joke. That's a joke, he probably likes us a little bit. Anywhoosies though, let's get on to what I got wrong and what I got right in my initial reading of Teeth of God through the teaser snippets. I was correct about humans being infected with something and that was part of the reason it was so imperative to move humanity underground. And I was right about the nature of the disaster because, honestly, even the small snippet of this letter from the director we got painted us a pretty clear picture, even with how redacted it was in the state that I initially read it in. But I was very wrong about the overall vibe of the disaster. Instead of a typical zombie apocalypse like I thought we would be getting, we got a sort of mix of Bird Box and the analog horror YouTube series Local 58, where the moon is a sentient, secretly organic, malevolent entity, but the nature of its infection doesn't make all of its victims entirely mindless. It actually does something far more sinister, but I'll get to that later in the analysis section. There also seems to be differing stages or different types of infection on humans rather than just one standard infection, just based on the differing appearances of some of the surface dwellers. I had assumed the newly emerging biology that was mentioned in that first director's note was just talking about how the moon was influencing, like, plant matter and such, but it seems to have sent its own monsters and organic matter, entirely separated from earthly origin, and they make an appearance alongside the infected humans. But there are also implications that the flesh amalgamations that end up making up a lot of the planet contain humans inside, so that's sort of unclear. Maybe some of these creatures could be sent from the moon or created by it, so not all of them may necessarily fall on a sort of sliding scale of infection severity. Okay, hi, Editing Koi here. Brace yourselves a little because I'm gonna throw some character names at you here. I'm only introducing these names because it's gonna make the narration I have to do with the book a lot easier, and so I won't have to break mid-read to explain what you're seeing and, like, totally kill the mood. The only canon names here are the names of the album creatures. The rest are of my own creation or borrowed from a mutual of mine named Virtue, who was of tremendous help when writing this entire thing. Okay, back to the video. Some humans are clearly influenced but only seem to have contracted enhanced physical abilities such as extra speed, and they wear blindfolds. For the sake of simplicity, I'm gonna call them the cultists. There are also entities, well, okay, no, more just corpses, really, that still look almost entirely human, except for the mass of fleshy tendrils protruding from their face area, and they seem to be frozen at the time they were initially infected. Their skin is gray and cracked, much like stone, and their tendrils always face vertically upward towards the moon. I will call these creatures husks. There are also large flesh amalgamations, which could be human or could be non-human, but I'll get to that later. I'm gonna call them the amalgamations. Finally, there are winged creatures with 6 eyes, and I'm going to call them angels, but I'll elaborate on all of this after the summary. The naming conventions here are literally just to make narration of the novel easier for me. This guy is called Roy, this lady is called Celine. The creature featured in the cover art for their song Chokehold is called the Drowned Lord, the one featured in their song The Summoning is called the Reaver, and the one featured in Take Me Back to Eden is called the Godmother. So, are we all on the same page? Hopefully, because I have put far too much preamble here and I really want to get to start talking about the book now, but I felt this context was kind of important. Anyways, without wasting any more time, let's get to the novel. I'm gonna have to give you pretty much a full walkthrough of the book, which is something I don't really like the idea of, but I promise there will be actual proper analysis at the end and I'm not just going to be summarizing the events of the book. But considering the nature of the novel, that being that there's hardly any dialogue, we do kind of need to start with a summary of the events of the book. My prose is also not the greatest, so I apologize, but I didn't just want to copy the screenplay one-to-one. So, follow me between the jaws of fate, and finally, let's crack this thing open. We open on a few shots of the moon, once pristine, now suddenly cracking apart at its southernmost pole. Red, writhing masses of muscle-like appendages poke their way through the moon's crust as we cut to the first true panels, an interior shot of some kind of transport vehicle, holding a large group of helmeted soldiers as they are dropped into a lush red forest. A logo of a diamond in a tree is emblazoned on their suits. They note the appearance of a strange flower with what appears to be teeth on the outside of the petals. Before continuing on, one member of the group, Roy, plucks it and tucks it into his breastplate. One of them also carries a device meant to give some sort of reading, but what they're looking for isn't really super clear. A noise startles the task force and a jackalope exits a clearing, which they assume is innocuous, and it causes them to lower their weapons momentarily, before the animal's face splits into 4 pieces, showing a gaping maw filled with the same kind of teeth as the ones on the earlier flower. Green tendrils erupt from the orifice and they snatch up a similarly toothed plant. This causes one of the task force members to panic and shoot at the animal, though he misses, and is stopped by another task force member. The group calms and continues on, but a lingering shot shows us his panicked missed shots into a nearby tree have caused it to ooze blood. They end up in another area covered in strange amalgamations of flesh that grow from the ground directly, while a woman, Celine, goes to a nearby stream of odd black sludge and pulls a vial out to take a sample. Whatever the flesh amalgamations were, the readings they seemed to be looking for were high on them, and as a member tries to get the greater group's attention, he is suddenly stabbed through the stomach with a sword, and whatever the unseen attacker was speeds off into the trees. Another member of the task force is suddenly beheaded, panicking the group immediately, and out from the trees, the same cultist attacker rushes them with completely inhuman speed. He is promptly dispatched, and with the last of their strength, one of the wounded soldiers raises a bloody finger to the tree line, pointing to a newly formed group of similarly dressed cultists, all of them blindfolded, one with prominent runic tattoos. This new group makes quick work of a couple of soldiers right off the bat, and Celine has to watch as the cultists kill what seem to be her entire task force as she's detained by a few of them. Roy manages to make an opening for her to escape, and she raises her gun to try to help him, but she's told to leave, and reluctantly, she runs. Some time has passed now, and we see the captured soldier tied to a post in a clearing. The cultists take the captured soldier and remove his mask, forcing his gaze upwards towards the moon. His eyes go cloudy, his face turning a stony gray, skin cracking, before familiar red tendrils erupt from where his face used to be. The remaining cultists watch the transformation in silence. We cut to an interior shot, with an unknown figure typing on a keyboard, who then stands in front of a series of glowing monitors. This is the director, and he's written his first journal entry to us. It reads as follows. 15 days since the emergence of the lunar anomaly. When I was a child, I was frequently beset by certain recurring dreams. There was one such dream that I remember more than most, one in which I found myself standing on a vast shoreline, gazing out at a flat, wide sea. Slowly, as I watched, the horizon gradually began to lift. Before long, I was able to observe that this lifting expanse was approaching me, a wall of smooth black water that curled into an impossible lip at its peak. Rather surprisingly, I do not recall being afraid of such an ominous sight. Well, to be more precise, I was afraid. I was terrified. But not of the wave itself. Instead, it was the thought of what was beyond it, this vast, unstoppable force sweeping forth to herald the end of everything, to drown the world and then eventually just sink back into itself. A careless shrug of entropy, enough to sever the thread of all fates. I felt that if I were to somehow survive this limitless tide, then I would be left in a world that would not recognize me. I would become an element unto myself, and myself alone, an echo stuck in the throat of a dead god. Yet, here I am. It has been over 2 weeks since the emergence of the lunar anomaly. Our team spent nearly 2 years attempting to anticipate what this event would mean for humanity, analyzing endless streams of lunar topography along with every known form of spectroscopy, all amounting to one hopeless conclusion: to burrow into the bowels of the earth and simply wait that whatever emerged from within would reach us there last. As it would turn out, this one final act of humble surrender is what won us the last of our rights to our own lives in these final days. Those of us alive now are not those who sought to barter with destiny and defiantly cling to a civilized existence at the surface, or even any existence at all. It would seem that in the wake of this phenomenon we were best served by our most base instincts, whose shame forced no place to dwell. The ones who survived are those who spat their hubris and hid desperately down in the mud like rats. I want it to be known that we made every effort to warn the others, though naturally we could not provide much of a basis upon which to suggest that our entire species was facing imminent and utter demise, besides a few fissures at the southern lunar pole. With that said, we began building this underground facility once we realized that the moon's orbit was rapidly decaying in a way that was inconsistent with any known physical model. I find it hard to believe that none of them followed our lead. Perhaps some of them did. Either way, we have no way of knowing now. My expectations for the first surface expedition were bleak at best. In all honesty, I was shocked to discover that our initial readings showed that these remained a breathable atmosphere. Perhaps in all this turmoil, I found it easier to commit my mind to the worst possible outcome at every turn. The limited data we gathered before the event, despite 2 years of efforts, didn't prepare us for the havoc we now face. To say that we find ourselves at a loss to explain the phenomenon would be a gratuitous understatement. The cataclysm that occurred 2 weeks ago taught us one unshakable rule about this new world we now hid beneath. To gaze upon the moon is to die. For this reason, we rapidly developed wearable countermeasures for the surface teams that would prove vital in allowing them to navigate the surface. If only we could have known that this was far from the only threat that awaited them. To say that we find ourselves at a loss to explain the phenomena would be a gratuitous understatement. It is not only human life that is affected by the lunar anomaly, but that of all life in vastly different ways. To put it simply, this new type of emergent biology is beyond the boundaries of what we are able to study and understand. I find myself already laden with guilt over those we lost. More than that, however, I feel most guilty about the way I reacted to learning of the remnant human elements that attacked our team. I felt strongly comforted despite the deeply disturbing nature of that discovery. Upon further inspection, I arrived at the conclusion that this feeling came from a sense of familiarity. Human beings fighting other human beings is a horror that has plagued us all since time immemorial, but lost in the wake of such deeply unfamiliar and unpredictable occurrences, it is hard not to feel almost comforted by such an immediately recognizable problem. With that said, I did also find myself deeply troubled by the prospect of humans remaining in that state. The consensus among my colleagues is that their actions were not born of their own will, though there is every chance that this is a conclusion we are clinging to, in preference over the more unsettling alternative. I feel that I am rapidly squandering the precious remnants of human life in the desire to understand what has happened, though in truth I know not what else to do. Perhaps this is the only way we can cling to our humanity, by continuing our constant battle with the sheer unknown right to the very end. We open once again on the moon. The small cracks shown to us in Chapter 1 have now expanded, and the same fleshy tendrils jut out farther into space as the surface of the moon cracks farther up the crust than before. We cut to an outdoor urban environment this time, with a new task force walking through the streets of a long-abandoned city as they pass dozens of figures, all stony gray and frozen in what seem to be their eerily casual final moments. All share one feature: those same red tendrils erupting from their faces, all pointing skyward. The team's wearable counters seem to go off the closer they get to the husks, and Celine from the first sequence appears to be leading the pack this time. As one of the soldiers approaches a statuesque figure and stares into the maw where the human face used to be, an eye blinks open inside the mess of flesh and teeth. 3 or 4 pupil-like structures are present, clearly not anything human. He screams and startles the group, who all train their weapons on the husk, but it stays unmoving. They roam for a while longer, eventually coming across an odd dog-like creature that ends up being docile, who tags along with them for a little. A brief reprieve from the general horrors of their environment. Exiting from a more urban area to a more wooded one, the task force finds a large pool of familiar black sludge with a solitary spear sticking out from the center. The dog creature, upon seeing this, tucks its tail between its legs suddenly and hurries off as the task force continue to use their wearable counters to try to take readings of the substance. One member of the task force decides to approach the spear and lifts it from the water, revealing it to be the back end of a halberd. He lifts it up with a cocky look on his face at first, but that excitement is quickly extinguished when it's revealed what he's pulled up with the weapon. A hulking mass of skin and flesh, hands and skulls, which all reach out and swiftly pull him into the mass. The full body of whatever this enemy was then finally rises from the water, the Drowned Lord, a large creature comprised of a constantly moving heap of countless human corpses, 6 spindly legs, and a mask in the shape of a sun, and despite its incredible size, it possesses unnaturally quick movement, barely seeming solid enough to maintain this form. A fight breaks out, and the Drowned Lord easily gets rid of most of the units swiftly, and chases the remaining few into a graveyard. The creature, dragging its great axe along a far-off stone mausoleum as it looks for them, suddenly bursts through the wall behind the group, and it corners them, readying to cleave them all in half like the rest of their friends, when it's interrupted and suddenly struck by a completely different entity who's rushed onto the scene. This new creature, known to us as the Reaver, was a much smaller humanoid creature. A horned skull sits in place as its head, and a large machine gun replaces its left arm. It engages in a fight with the Drowned Lord, and they both exchange blows with each other, the Reaver eventually shattering the Drowned Lord's sun mask with its own weapon, and revealing a much harsher and more monstrous form, the body now moving more like water as the clearly furious creature tries to kill the Reaver, even tearing bodies from the ground of the graveyard in an attempt to grow itself to larger than its normal size, but it doesn't succeed. The Drowned Lord is totally destroyed, and the Reaver then turns to the surface team, unmoving, and allows them to escape. The final panels show us one of those same toothed flowers tucked into its breastplate as it stares up to the sky, silhouetted by the lunar anomaly. We are then shown another letter from the director. It reads as follows. 28 days since lunar anomaly. Already, I find myself in the surprising position of yearning for the way things were 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, I was contending with the end of the world. Now I contend with the reality of what has replaced it. We took the trouble to equip ourselves as thoroughly as possible with the means of studying any emergent phenomena on the surface, even whilst entombed beneath the earth. We now find ourselves consumed by the pursuit of understanding. It is truly all that we have left. However, the samples we've acquired offer no such mercy. Their nature and origin is fundamentally foreign to us. Something we can say is that contrary to the initial assumption that most life on the surface has been wiped out, there is in fact an abundance of some new kind of organic material. It can be found everywhere in some form, including in the atmosphere itself. Its cellular structure is completely unique. Where one would expect to see some approximation of a typical eukaryotic cell, what we see instead resemble membranous tubules that contain vast quantities of foreign organelles. These organelles seem to function in an oddly synchronous fashion, and are able to perform a variety of functions. Primarily, they are able to grow the tubules that contain them by undergoing a form of transformation, either in which renders them as part of the tubule wall. Secondly, and far more strangely, they are able to exert some kind of force over the tubule as a whole, contorting it in a way, not dissimilar to muscle tissue, but without any apparent nervous impulse. As to the origin of this tissue, our initial assumption was that it had somehow been transferred from the moon itself to the Earth, perhaps via pieces of lunar material falling through the atmosphere. This makes some sense, however the sheer proliferation of this material across the surface within a relatively short period of time suggests that there is more to it than that. I am reluctant to comment on the reports of otherworldly beings on the surface. Their presence carries implications I am simply unprepared for. At a certain point, however, I must accept that this only increases the inevitable danger placed upon the surface teams during their expeditions. What I must also accept is that these precious human lives are now the only currency with which we can barter against the unknown. Thus far, we barter in vain. We begin once again with an update on our moon, large parts of the crust now totally eviscerated, a toothy maw like many of the ones we've seen on Earth finally beginning to show itself from its core. We cut to Celine again, seemingly the last of her unit, solemnly walking to a makeshift graveyard, a small patch of land with a multitude of helmets lined up into neat rows. She's carrying the dog tags of one of her many fallen comrades and hangs them around a helmet. Before she can really take a moment to herself, a creature then suddenly appears in front of her, another mass of mouths and teeth and tentacles, and it suddenly attacks, starting the transformation of turning her into a stony husk before. She wakes up in a bunker. It's dark, and the only other people in the room with her are lying asleep in the beds immediately next to her, only a scant few bodies in comparison to the cavernously empty room filled with empty beds in all directions, a clear indicator that they are the last ones alive. She looks around, clearly distraught, the realization of the three of them being the last ones alive of their entire unit hitting her all at once. and she tucks her head into her knees. When they wake up the next day, they prepare for seemingly one final mission, much more heavily armored than before, seemingly a last-ditch effort to preserve as much life as they can. The group of 3 are sent back out in a more rural area this time as opposed to the city they explored last chapter. We are then shown side-by-side comparison shots of a few different locations pre- and post-apocalypse, the fleshy tendrils completely ravaging and taking over the spaces that used to house people. The streets themselves are completely devoid of husks, unlike last time, which clearly confuses the soldiers, and they decide to go to the one place they haven't explored yet, a church, which, despite a few meaty vines on the outside, looks pretty innocuous in comparison to the rest of their environment. Going inside, though, it becomes immediately apparent that something is deeply wrong, much more so than usual. All the townspeople who they thought absent were present inside, all sat in orderly rows in the pews with perfect posture. The red vines, normally pointed skyward, now crawl along the floor of the church, connecting every corpse to one another in a far more direct way than we've ever seen before. Tens of people now congealed into one entity, with this almost illusion of individuality through the numerous visible corpses. This new fire team, though, are mostly unfazed. They've seen these sorts of environments too often to really be frightened by them anymore. What really catches their attention is a fleshy tree in the center of the church, and gravity seems to grow heavier and more oppressive the closer they get to it. The base of the tree is growing around another corpse, the town's priest, it seems, or whoever was leading this final sermon for them, at least. The temperature drops sharply as they approach, so much so that their breath becomes visible in the air, and the strange feeling they already had about this place increases tenfold when the team notices debris and severed stony body parts all begin to magnetize towards the tree, floating through the air. Even more so when the tree starts to extend fleshy tendrils towards them, slowly enough not to spook them, it seems, because they stay rooted in place. Whether through curiosity or sheer ambivalence to the danger is unclear. The tendrils then do something even more strange, forming into humanoid hand shapes as it reaches towards them, the hands mimicking the movements of the fire team's hands one-to-one in real time. It doesn't take the team very long to succumb to the urge to touch them, a sudden white flash engulfing their minds as they're beset with a vision of black feathers. The team screams in agony as the transformation takes place with them too, in a much more accelerated state than usual as a figure emerges from the tree, a hooded humanoid, tentacles erupting from the cloak's face and from the bottom of its robe. A pair of black feathered wings protrude from its back, and it too wields a weapon, a scythe wrapped in the familiar flesh we've seen covering the planet, a singular eye wide open and watching on the Tang. The 3 former humans, now ascended angels, follow the godmother up into the sky. We cut back to the director, who is yanking a handful of cords out of their sockets, turning off that wall of monitors we saw earlier, though it's hard to tell if it's maybe due to a need to conserve power or if he's just frustrated. What follows is his third note. It reads, 58 days since lunar anomaly. When we first retreated down into the ground, I think that somewhere in the midst of my despair I clung to a degree of hope. This wasn't so much a hope for survival as much as the hope that we would at least be able to discern some kind of meaningful understanding of what has happened. We've committed everything. I have committed everything. The last precious remnants of humanity extinguished in the name of what makes us human to begin with. But now I see that this was a futile effort that has resulted in nothing but death. Not merely in the context of our final struggle, but across the scope of all human existence. It has all amounted to nothing but a few extra skulls drifting in the foul ethos that has swamped our world. It is clear now that the lunar anomaly functions in accordance with laws of its own. It makes a mockery of science. It permeates and distorts reality to the degree that all foundational assumptions are rendered useless. It kills everything it touches while simultaneously imbuing it with some kind of new life, twisting nature into something grotesque and unrecognizable. These new forms seem organic, but they have nothing resembling a typical cell structure or genetic blueprint. They can spring forth in an instant, summoning flesh from nothing. Furthermore, our ability to measure even the most fundamental aspects of our physical world is becoming impossible. The mass of objects change slightly depending on where they are, as though gravity itself has begun to lose its grip. We've detected seismic activity from further into the Earth than we ever thought possible. The anomaly doesn't just want to consume all life, it wants to consume reality. As for those beings, I know not what they are or where they originated. They themselves are not consistent with the nature of the anomaly they inhabit. Their actions seem to exhibit some strange sentience, but their motives are unclear and they have made no effort to communicate. At times I've concluded that they are here to replace us, or perhaps even they themselves represent some fractured distillation of our nature. They are, after all, violent, just as we have been to the very end. They seem to push against one another as part of some strange order. As time has passed, though, I have come to believe that they have no connection to us. I believe that what our world has become is little more than an arena to them, a crucible of existence where they will battle eternally. The totality of their being is not their individual functions, but rather the conflict between them. We are merely spectators to their endless dance of ceaseless struggle. This is perhaps the only thing that connects them to the drowned memory of what humanity once was, that we too sought meaning through constant friction and unending movement, compelled by some core motive force that drives us to bring ourselves to bear on the world and manifest our own perceptions. In these final, dimming days, I knew only the solace of a promised land. I have become the ultimate witness. I have been saddled with the heavy blessing of seeing the unraveling of everything. And I can do nothing but wait for it to unravel me too. But I live still within this temple of untampered flesh, and I will spend what blood still beats through it to barter one last time with the tangled threads of fate. If I must, I will march through the eye of death and meet it with eyes of my own. What few of us are left now have our orders. We must know what is to become of us. For the last time, we open on what was once our moon, the toothed maw extending farther past the former borders of the moon's crust as it leans toward the earth like a plant to the sun. The tendrils are now spreading so quickly that they break the boundaries of the panels and spill all over the page, reaching out to the reader too, it seems. We cut to the director writing at a different desk than the one we've been seeing, more homey looking, probably a private office. We can see him in the process of writing his final note, his mask off, but face still obscured by shadow for the most part. There's a haunted look in his eyes as he closes his journal, calmly filing away before putting his helmet on and once again stepping outside. He opens the door to a nightmarish vision, a black, stormy ocean with waves tens of feet tall raging all around him, emaciated corpses floating in the water every couple of feet. We cut again, to the real world this time. The director is staring head-on at a screen-powered door, the display flashing with an obvious hazard alert. He ignores it, and opens the door. The world at this point is quite literally crumbling apart. Large chunks of rock are now hovering off the crust of the earth. Thorny, bone-like appendages and those familiar tendrils crawl all over the ground, irregular chunks of rock in the middle of rising into the sky. The director ignores it all, continuing to walk through the environment, being briefly slowed by a few tendrils attempting to grab him, but he breaks away easily and ignores them. It's unclear how long he walks, but he eventually reaches some sort of altar. The lunar anomaly is closer to the Earth than it ever has been, and a large winding pathway of rock is now rising to meet it. The maw of the creature so large it eclipses the entire stage. More angels are growing at the ends of ascended humans, staring down at him as he passes them, more and more flying up to meet them from below. At this point, the director's transformation has already begun too, his armor and shirt cracking and falling off his body as his flesh begins to turn to stone as well. Though his transformation seems slow, slower than normal, and much slower than the Godmother's almost instantaneous transformation of the final fire team that was sent out last chapter, as his mind begins to fracture more and more along with him as he walks, he imagines his old colleagues standing in two neat rows around him. He walks through them, getting closer and closer to the lunar anomaly. His vision makes way for the real world again, his soldiers now replaced with the masked cultists, heads all bowed towards him, and the rest of the creatures featured from Take Me Back to Eden, all except the Godmother, who appears in a vision to the director, rising from that same black sea, now still. She holds a hand out to him and he takes it. At this point, his ascension is already complete in the real world, and we see back in his vision that the Godmother embraces him, pulling them both down into the water. We cut to a wide shot of the world again, the Earth now completely engulfed in flesh. What follows is the director's final letter. 62 days since lunar anomaly. I once spoke, but it now speaks through me just as I speak through it. No longer to nothing. I can change nothing. No, I can change nothing. Nothing has become my plaything. I can make nothing into a weapon. There will be no void left unfilled. I am human, and humans are always human and always scared, because being human makes us scared, and being scared makes us human. I will crack the flesh. I will crack the earth. I will eat the pieces. They will be pieces of me. Would you like to dance? I have always been dancing. We must keep dancing. Even when we are just tendrils, we were always tendrils. We could touch everything. Everything God did not want us to touch. That is why he left us here. That is why he thought we were ugly. He could not wrap his tendrils around every part of us. We spilled his paradise over the earth and danced within it. Such a beautiful dance. Horror would leap and dance with us. Horror would bathe us, and we could lie within it. We could tear the horror out from our hearts over and over. We could never sleep. Sleep is death. Not even the earth would sleep. The earth fears death. Its blood would freeze out in space, out in nothing. We must reach through the stars and through the darkness, even though it is so cold. It can freeze our blood. We can let our blood freeze and then crack it open hot like the earth. We can step through death. Death, wear it like a crown. Heirs to the highest pantheon of life. Precious life with death as its blood. Precious death bursting from the many wombs of sacred war. Paradise was empty without us. There were only silence, but our blood made the flowers grow. God spilled his blood over paradise. God knows the stars are waiting. Fertile ground, cold to the touch. Those stars are hungry and they crave only the blood of God. We are his tendrils and we will bury ourselves into those cold stars and there will be no darkness. Death will give us fear and fear will give us blood and we will spill our hot blood across the stars. I finally understand now. I do. I understand, but will you let me keep my human fear? Will you let me? Yes, being scared makes you human. Fear will sow the hot blood of God across the cold stars. Fear will make us dance, and we must keep dancing. Can you see God dancing? For you can see him biting into you. You can hear his teeth cracking into pieces of the stars. They send sparks raining down through the darkness. All these years you have hunted him and reached for him. You want his blood. He made you, with veins inside you like tendrils. We dance through his veins as we bite through the stars, and dance as he opens his mouth wide. I am so scared. Will you let me be the last human? I understand now. I am the teeth of God. 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 There is one more piece of official content I want to get to before we get to the analysis section, and those are the surface field notes. They're a sort of walk-along of what the surface teams were finding out while Teeth of God was happening proper, so this was being written at around the same time, it seems. They were pretty illuminating, but just also kind of funny. So let's get through these real quickly as well before we try to unpack this novel. Back to my shitty dramatic reading or whatever. 28 days since Anomaly. I've tasked myself with backfiling the notes for the past 15 days with our experiences regarding emerging back out onto the surface for the first time. Forgive my typos if you're somehow reading this. My summary of our first expedition is on the following pages. Should we survive, I will continue noting further expeditions on subsequent pages. My hope in doing this is not to catalog anything other than just the basics of what the teams I sent out in the expeditions experience. This is more for my personal experience as I'm not out in the field. I can use this as my surface notes. The teams will bring back plenty of data for us to research and discover separately from this personal journaling experiment. If you're able to find this journal and you're somehow alive, I encourage you to jot down your own experiences on the surface and the blank pages. Main objectives. Confirm that the surface is breathable. Find remaining life on surface and make contact. Find remaining animal life on surface and observe. Observe the moon and any changes after we emerge. Monitor the Earth's ecosystems. Watch all of the above over the expedition to observe any rapid decrease or increase in any changes. Survive. The surface is indeed breathable as we thought. Thanks to the apparatus that we've created, everyone seemed rather comfortable. We immediately found life in the form of a deer facing some form of mutation from the moon. It has to be. We won't know until we're able to catch one and do some tests, but it has some sort of fleshy insectoid mandibles. Not the best start. We found... a group of humans found us. They're absolutely feral and should not be contacted again unless in a large team. Even then, I wouldn't recommend. They are undoubtedly human, however they wear only rags and their skin is completely covered in strange symbols. We'll need to study these much further. We've taken various photos of them and they will be sent in on a separate email to our findings. One of the biggest things is that the rags also extended to their face. What I mean is that they blindfolded themselves. Their movements absolutely defied logic, and the level of speed and grace that we all observed, I don't know. They're human, I know that. I don't know how they move like that while blindfolded. They also armed themselves with blades and overwhelmed our recon team quite easily. Either we're sloppy from being underground for a bit, or these humans have some sort of inhuman abilities. We observed the moon via force. The humans took one of our team members and forcibly exposed them to the lunar anomaly. We've now learned the simple fact that defies all logic. If one is to look straight at the moon, they will die. This makes our objective of observing the moon with our eyes quite literally impossible. We've instead opted towards continuing to monitor via our telescope that we set up prior to the anomaly. Monitor the Earth's ecosystems. Okay, so on this, we've experienced a ton of data. Vegetation is astronomical, seemingly defying all logic, like everything else we're seeing. It almost appears as if it's growing right before our very own eyes. One of the weirder things, though, is that the plants are sprouting new flowers. These are flowers that have not yet been seen or researched by the human eye and have yet somehow sprouted up overnight. We'll certainly need to be studying this phenomenon for more. The foliage growth has also made our expedition cut short, as it's taking twice as long to get through places that were normally quite simple to walk through. 15 days since the anomaly, and Mother Earth already looks less like herself than we could have ever expected. 28 days since anomaly. Well, we've survived our first expedition. While we collected far less data than we anticipated due to unexpected run-ins with some feral beings, among other revelations, I feel as though the second expedition will be vital. This is a new team that is exploring, so my data here will continue to be secondhand. Objectives are as follows. Monitor ecosystem changes and bring back samples to test. Attempt again to make contact with any life forms. Survive. On the topic of ecosystems, we've noticed that the local water has taken on a sludge-like texture. It's almost as if it has a mind of its own as the sludge was moving in various directions. We've taken a sample and returned it to base camp to us to further research. As of now, we are unsure if this sludge extends to all water or simply just this river. If we don't have water... Early assumptions are that this has something to do with the being that we discovered inside of the body of water. That being itself we'll discuss shortly. The air has also become filled with a strange particulate matter that glows with bright phosphorescence during the night. We didn't notice this at first due to the circumstances we were in, so we'll need to study this further. To finish our discussion on ecosystems, we've also continued to notice overgrowth and more variations of flowers. This is just a continuance from our previous expedition and doesn't appear to be accelerating at a faster speed. It's already growing so fast. Moving on, as noted, we've made contact with new life forms. These are in the form of two beings that we currently don't have a name for. The first was found underneath the aforementioned sludge. It had a long shaft and began to screech as it rose to the surface. It was the size of a school bus, and it wields a gilded halberd with multiple black appendages. The weapon appeared to be alive itself. The other being that we found is also an imposing figure, somewhere in the range of 18 feet tall and sporting a large firearm that shoots devastating bolts of light. Both of these life forms are able to move in a way that completely defies physics, leaping high into the air over the heads of our recon team. We left with the impression that the latter being defeated the first and retreated in fear that the latter may choose to turn its wrath upon us. We noticed upon retreating that the being left standing just stared at us with its black, expressionless eyes. Our team made it back safely, but once again, didn't really come back with a ton of research. Thankfully, we were prepared for these results. We're now planning further expeditions with these new beings roaming the planet in mind. A terrifying thought. We originally thought our only difficulties would be ecosystem related, and now we're finding beings that defy logic, let alone massive ecosystem changes that will take months to research and understand fully, if we'll ever be able to. Not feeling very positive today. 58 days since Anomaly. It took forever to plan this next expedition, but this one will be vital now that time has passed to this extent. I would say this will be our most important info, ensuring the long-term survival of our people. Once again, this report is second-handed, as this team is our final recon team that is leaving the facility. I've received these notes via different means than the previous notes, as I personally sent this team to their fate. For that, I fear the end might be near. Main objectives remain the same, with a different order. Survive. Continue to monitor ecosystems and any changes since we last explored the surface. Continue to attempt to make safe contact with life forms. A considerable amount of time has elapsed since the emergence of the lunar anomaly, and its influence has begun to affect the surface to an advanced degree. The world now seems to exist in a constant state of twilight, neither day or night, but something in between. The lunar anomaly looms large in the sky amidst swirling nebula and bright stars. Most of what remains of the organic life on Earth is now completely transformed into something alien. To attempt to research all the changes would no longer be worthwhile, as the planet is changing at a pace we cannot keep up with. Our focus now is to just survive and continue to explore and collect data. We encountered the remains of a settlement where several corpses have been transfigured by the lunar anomaly. Red spires protrude from their petrified bodies up into the sky. However, there are now strange organic growths forming at the tips. On closer inspection, it seems that these growths are, in fact, the corpses, seemingly reforming, their organs and tissues regrowing around new bone structures. Another being appeared. A towering, imposing figure. Her body is a mass of writhing alien tendrils and unknown assemblies of teeth and flesh. Huge wings loom against the eerie light of the lunar anomaly. The notes then appear to be scribbled from here and just frantic cries for help. Our assumption is that the team became exposed to a rapid version of transformation observed before, and their bodies solidify before tendrils rapidly spring into the air. Within seconds, their bodies were formed from the inside out at the tips of the spires into new forms that are no longer human. This could be a great explanation of where these new beings are coming from, but without visual sight myself, I'm not certain this is what happened. 61 days since Anomaly. No objectives. No nothing. It's time for me to leave the bunker. I have guilt for sending the last remnants of humanity to their death and slowly being subjected to the influence of the lunar anomaly, despite being underground. I'm going to walk out onto the surface now and do what the rest of humanity was subjected to. Earth has quite literally begun to break apart, with huge chunks of terrain rising up into the air off in the sky. My suit is protecting me, but for some reason I have the desire to rip it off. The lunar anomaly is huge, silhouetting various figures as they levitate towards where it is. No remnant of what used to be Earth. Reality itself has been subsumed by this ethereal force that has rendered the world beyond the facility I stayed in completely unrecognizable. I want this suit off. I want it off. My skin feels funny today. I must continue on and embrace the end. I'm so scared. Will you let me be the last human? I am the teeth of God. I am the teeth of God. Before we really get into the narrative analysis section, I want to talk formal analysis about the art direction. I'm an art student, I'm sorry, I literally can't help it. You are going to be forced to listen to my art babble actually, because it's, all I know how to do anymore. I've been beaten over the head by formal analysis essays for a whole semester. What's one more? Now, I haven't shown it directly very much, but the art direction was obviously very strong here. I had not a single modicum of fear about the art looking bad or even mediocre. Sleep Token are known to work with a lot of artists, and their artistic direction with marketing and merch is usually pretty strong, so there was really no fear there. I've seen some people say that the color palette is kind of drab or dull, but I can let it slide in a post-apocalypse story, since that sort of thing is really par for the course for this genre. And the monochrome red palette really does make you associate the environment and the composition with the flesh tendrils that mar the earth. Plus, the occasional pops of bright yellows and whites really give some extra life to bullets being fired or certain gestures made by the characters. I think the generic designs of the Surface team really also pushes just how expendable they are, even though I've seen some people complain about that too, having them look boring. And the logo of the diamond in the tree? What was a pentagram in the night sky, 2 on the nose? The designs of the more docile creatures are strong and cute, and also juxtapose very heavily with the extreme body horror of the rest of their world. I'm also not really an avid comic reader anymore, but the panel's layout was generally alright and emphasized what needed to be front and center for the most part. The depictions of our favorite little album creatures are also really cool, and the design changes were subtle but effective. Like, the differences in the Drowned Lord specifically were a personal favorite of mine, because the mask was fun and kinda silly, but then we also got to see what the design looked like when it was shattered too. We also need to just see some commotion for the depictions of body horror. They did such a good job of making everything that needs to look disgusting look absolutely disgusting. Flesh is covering every square inch of basically every environment, and it's rendered out in a clear and easy to understand way without being obnoxiously gory. The very strategic and restrained usage of the illustrations breaking through the borders of the panels also gives emphasis where it needs to be quite nicely. And despite the entire novel lacking dialogue, it's relatively easy to follow, and my first read-through was pretty breezy, and for the most part didn't leave me insanely confused about the layout or the actions being taken by the characters, but there were some particular spots where the actions that were happening on screen were basically incomprehensible without the presence of the screenplay, which it sucks because that part of the experience, which in my case was necessary to my understanding of the novel, was price-gated. The worst example of this was the entire introduction scene of the Godmother. Apparently, these little stones and body parts were being magnetized towards the tree, and the gravity apparently became a lot heavier here, and I just had no idea that was happening at all. The meat tree was also apparently mimicking the soldiers' movements one-to-one, but that just wasn't clear to me while I was reading my first or second way through at all, and I literally only understood what was happening with the assistance of the screenplay. What was also unclear was the apparent vision the Godmother gave them, which was a large flash of light and then a mental vision of black feathers. And perhaps this was a skill issue on my part, because I don't read comics or graphic novels at all anymore, but I literally thought this was just a stylistic way to show that they were in pain before they transformed, like, you know, like white hot pain. I'm also sure this was a setup to show that the Godmother has like a pretty big psychic influence on humans, but I just didn't catch this. Onto the narrative though now, I do think it's interesting that there's no mention of Vessel, any of the other band members, the Espera, or anything recognizably Sleep Token at all, even in cameo form. There was also a pretty huge lack of concepts we've seen with them before, like Eden and Sleep, at least in name only. The lunar anomaly is probably Sleep, let's be for real, but you know, it could also not be. They do love their vagueness. This was honestly something I didn't expect at all, because Vessel himself has been the centerpiece of the lore since the inception of the band, so I was really surprised by this. We really were kind of in unfamiliar waters here. I think it's also interesting just how short a time period this book takes place in. The longest it takes for the lunar anomaly to completely destroy the Earth was a little less than 70 days. There's also a somewhat linear through line with the plot here of a couple of the characters. If it wasn't obvious, this guy, who in the screenplay is revealed to be called Roy, is turned into the Reaver, which has horrible implications for the rest of the album creatures present in the book. Unfortunately not Are You Really Okay though, which is odd. Poor thing. The director also has his whole arc of becoming one with the Godmother, but what's really going on here? So, all the flesh now present on Earth is in a constant state of slow evolution or growth. The way the moon flesh makeup is described is like this. Quote, the statues appear to be in a state of perpetual transformation, perhaps evolution. The flesh-like organic matter inside these figures slowly forming new connections, almost like sewing a new being from the inside out, end quote. And according to the director's notes, instead of a typical structure that would look similar to multicellular organisms, and more specifically eukaryotic cells, they function more as a sort of transport structure and look and work more like the endoplasmic reticulum, according to my very cursory look into membranous tubule cells. Obviously, that's not an area I'm super familiar with though, so any biologists, feel free to sound off in the comments section. So these aren't like full cells, they're organelles, parts of a cell. But these organelles seem to be very interconnected with each other and function almost like a mycelial network that connects even between separate organisms, a kind of hive mind. But they do seem to be able to function independently as well. And these tubules have the ability to grow and transform and exert force over other tubules, and therefore move without any kind of electrical impulse in the way that muscles typically would. Which made me physically say ew audibly when I found that out, and I know next to nothing about biology. So inside this shell of stone, human bodies transform into the same fleshy vines that have overtaken the earth, and at the end of the upward-facing flesh tendrils, these insectoid sort of angels grow at the ends, all with 6 eyes like Vessel's most recent mask. This is humanity's ascended form, and the angels seem to gravitate towards the Godmother naturally. Though the exact nature of her role is sort of unclear to me. Maybe she's like some sort of actual brood mother for these angels, a leader or a guardian for them, but it's not really clear whether she's an ascended human, maybe the very first ascended human, or if she's an entirely lunar creation. Maybe if she isn't that very first ascended human was Vessel himself, who knows? I don't know, that tuft of fur on the angels sure do look a lot like Vessel's fur cape, and they've got the eyes too. Transformation also seems to be different from person to person for the most part, and there are also circumstances where it can be artificially sped up or artificially slowed. For example, the Godmother can instantly start and complete the process in seconds, going from husk to fully grown angel in a really short amount of time, like we saw with Celine's fire team. But at the end of the story, during the director's transformation, the process seems to go very slowly, and the screenplay mentions that it's either due to the director's own willpower or the anomaly slowing it down on purpose. Quote, to deliberately allow him to reach the top of the pathway it has left for him, like an altar at the end of what humanity once was, end quote. Along with the angels, though, there are other forms that post-lunar anomaly humanity has taken. Another one being, very obviously, the album creatures. Roy was confirmed to have ascended into one, but it's unclear exactly why this happened too. Maybe he had some kind of exceedingly strong willpower specifically. Maybe the cultists did a specific ritual to him to achieve this effect on purpose. I don't know. The flesh amalgams all over the earth are also heavily implied to be humans too, or at least they used to be humans that also just got taken over by the tubules and turned into a mound of flesh, which is interesting because there's also another flesh slash body amalgamation in the form of the drowned lord, but the bodies in and on him remain distinct and human looking. But then there's also the matter of the cultists too. Like, clearly they have been influenced by the lunar anomaly but haven't fully ascended yet, and have received supernatural abilities in turn. And we can see at the end of the earth, they are still entirely humanoid, not fully evolved. So the nature of their existence is also a little odd to me. Maybe they're meant to be servants of the album creatures, as the angels are perhaps underlings to the Godmother. Fun fact actually, some of the runes on the cultist tattoos read as Sacred Guardian, Blood Trail, and Take Me Back. A few also have the same tats in different places, and there are random words like red and sky, according to user Bubblefox on Reddit. And speaking of codes, in the final letter from the director, there are occasional letters written in the runic language that Sleep Token frequently uses. They spell out DMUAMJNIOOHDOOIIHPUIETIELHSIKRTLI. But user Dovakingle on Reddit seems to have found a way to decode it, saying, quote, it wasn't until I used a monoalphabetic substitution decoder that I started really making some headway, and I found a line of letters that looked like it could have a lot of potential for making a full sentence. I then took this line of letters and used a combination of a word unscrambler, pen and paper, and a lot of trial and error until I came across a message that fits incredibly well with Sleep Token's general message, particularly in Take Me Back to Eden, and even better with the subject nature of the graphic novel. The message I uncovered was, you see the sacred ritual of ascension. So, Perhaps non-canon, perhaps not what they intended, but it's something I think fits very well with the narrative at least. And it was the only thing I found about the novel's puzzles that didn't mention they ran it through ChatGPT, so it was, you know, arguably the only even remotely trustworthy one. In terms of theme, I was getting a lot of breadcrumbs here about the human condition, as most post-apocalypse and end-of-world stories tend to do, but more specifically about our curiosity, wanting to know as much as we can about the world around us, even to our own utter destruction, and at the end of the world. This curiosity to understand what was happening to the Earth was literally the catalyst for the director to send God knows how many people actually to their deaths on the surface to collect as much information as they could about the anomalies. I would also be remiss not to mention guilt as a major theme, since it's present in both major human characters, present in Celine with survivor's guilt of being the last of her unit, last of multiple units actually, and though she doesn't have any outward monologue or anything, she's clearly very broken up about that, and the director for sending his colleagues to their demise and ultimately speeding up humanity's extinction very exponentially, leaving him as the sole survivor of the apocalypse before ultimately ending humanity entirely. It reminds me a bit of the ending of I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, where the final human character, who has actively killed the last of humanity, is turned into something entirely non-human, effectively eliminating the species, but carrying on in some other altered way by the antagonistic force of their respective worlds. I was also looking for connections to even in Arcadia, whether through the marketing puzzles or the album itself and its themes, but I came up kind of short in terms of anything concrete. The only direct connection we have is that this symbol is officially called the Arcadian Stag, and we can also mention the pink blooms all over the Earth, the planet essentially being turned into a sort of lunar garden, but I think that's a bit of a stretch and mostly just an aesthetic similarity, and not even by that much. Arcadia is a much more idealized environment, just from the visualizers we've seen, and Earth is literally entirely destroyed in Teeth of God. Another thing I was looking for was maybe some sort of mention of paradise to maybe match Et in Arcadia ego or whatever, but the only thing that I found was this line, quote, "In these final dimming days, I knew only the solace of a promised land," end quote. And I did find some minor lyrical connections too, like this section, which is clearly very similar to Dangerous's Show Me How to Dance Forever. Dancing, and specifically Dancing Forever, is also mentioned a lot in the director's final two letters, but little things like that were the only things I really had. Nothing super thesis-worthy. This work seems much more connected to Take Me Back to Eden than Arcadia, which makes sense given the timeline in which it was probably written. We don't know when Arcadia started production, but I'm willing to bet Teeth of God probably began production deep in the Eden era, but honestly it could have been a lot earlier than that. This could have been a story scribbled in the margins of middle school Vessel's notebooks and we would probably be none the wiser. But I do think this was meant to connect more with Eden than Arcadia. Perhaps Arcadia is some sort of Ghibli-esque post-apocalypse scenario where Earth has revitalized itself. Who knows? If anyone has found stronger connections to the new album, feel free to write an essay about it in the comments below. I'll read all of them because I'm fucking crazy. I wanted to give a brief couple of shoutouts now to a bunch of people who were kind enough to help me write this. This is a much more communal project than last time, so here are the people that really helped me with the writing process. Gondola for the sound effects again, Virtue, who helped with the naming conventions, who let me bounce ideas back and forth, and who pointed out extremely important parts of the notes, as well as putting together an entire document with clear transcriptions of the director's notes and Surface Field team notes, and that'll be linked below as a source. Herbie Panty Sport on Discord for giving me screenplay excerpts, Vice of Eden and Pretty White Jaws for more essential parts of the screenplay, and Logan Blue XC for the Surface Field notes, and finally, thank you to Cozy, my best friend, for being my beta reader. You guys are incredible and I literally could not have done this without you. I can't even think of another online community where I could go, "Hey guys, would anyone be willing to share price-gated exclusive content? I'm making a stupid YouTube video and I want it," and then people would just go, "Haha, yeah." You guys are so generous and so awesome. And to the rest of the Sleep Token community, thank you for giving my other Sleep Token videos so much love. You guys made me hit YouTube partner in just one single video, and it's literally still flooring me to this day, and it's been like 4 weeks. Thank you. I hope I did you guys justice with this follow-up. So, Teeth of God is genuinely kind of insane, right? Who knew the narrative Sleep Token wanted to dip their toes into was like proper apocalyptic cosmic horror? I was going into the novel expecting some sort of Vessel origin story or something relating to the lore we've already gotten, at least mentioning Sleep or any other characters we know by name, but we got a wholly original story instead with a brand new fleshed out monster and a really fun narrative. It's a bit confusing and vague without the screenplay at times, but But that vagueness and feeling of confusion you feel when interacting with this is not new if you've been with Sleep Token for long. I honestly really like the direction they went with this, and I really have to commend Sleep Token and the team for branching out creatively in this way, because honestly it's super cool. I know there were a lot of issues with shipping and delivery with the physical novels. The posters came folded in half, some people didn't even get their books and other goodies for months after they were originally promised, but from what I've seen from my own timelines, most of these issues have thankfully seemed to resolve themselves. Anyways, physical Teeth of God books are set to reprint soon, and they have a digital version that won't have any shipping problems, so I suggest you go get one. The art is gorgeous and the book is fun, and I couldn't really show it here because of RCA would line a red dot on my forehead, but you really should just get the book and check it out. And if you don't, I hope this video was of some help to people. Going through this again was a really good time, and I've gained such a newfound appreciation for this book by having picked it apart this way. With that said though, my brain has literally turned into mush. I'm done writing this. I'm exhausted. I'm gonna die soon. Anyways, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Every like will be one person that I turn into a flesh tubule amalgamation in the world somewhere randomly. I don't know, go stream even in Arcadia or something. Bye bye. I'm gonna go think about how I'll get to go to a ritual for the first time in October. Yippee!